The Gambler, by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Translated by C.J. Hogarth. Chapter 4. Today has been a day of folly, stupidity, and ineptness. The time is now 11 o'clock in the evening, and I am sitting in my room and thinking. It all began this morning with my being forced to go and play roulette for Polina Alexandrovna. When she handed me over her store of 600 gulden, I exacted two conditions, namely, that I should not go to halves with her in her winnings, if any, that is to say, I should not take anything for myself, and that she should explain to me that same evening why it was so necessary for her to win, and how much was the sum which she needed. For I could not suppose that she was doing all this merely for the sake of money. Yet clearly she did need some money, and that as soon as possible, and for a special purpose. Well, she promised to explain matters, and I departed. There was a tremendous crowd in the gaming rooms. What an arrogant, greedy crowd it was! I pressed forward towards the middle of the room until I had secured a seat at a croupier's elbow. Then I began to play in timid fashion, venturing only 20 or 30 gulden at a time. Meanwhile, I observed and took notes. It seemed to me that calculation was superfluous, and by no means possessed of the importance which certain other players attached to it, even though they sat with ruled papers in their hands, whereon they set down the coups, calculated the chances, reckoned, and lost exactly as we more simple mortals did, who played without any reckoning at all. However, I deduced from the scene one conclusion which seemed to me reliable, namely, that in the flow of fortuitous chances there is, if not a system, at all events a sort of order. This, of course, is a very strange thing. For instance, after a dozen middle figures there would always occur a dozen or so outer ones. Suppose the ball stopped twice at a dozen outer figures. It would then pass to a dozen of the first ones, and then again to a dozen of the middle ciphers, and fall upon them 3 or 4 times, and then revert to a dozen outers, whence, after another couple of rounds, the ball would again pass to the first figures, strike upon them once, and then return thrice to the middle series, continuing thus for an hour and a half, or 2 hours. 1, 3, 2, 1, 3, 2. It was all very curious. Again, for the whole of a day or a morning the red would alternate with the black, but almost without any order, and from moment to moment, so that scarcely 2 consecutive rounds would end upon either the one or the other. Yet next day, or perhaps the next evening, the red alone would turn up, and attain a run of over 2 score, and continue so for quite a length of time, say for a whole day. Of these circumstances the majority were pointed out to me by Mr. Astley, who stood by the gaming table the whole morning, yet never once staked in person. For myself, I lost all that I had on me, and with great speed. To begin with, I staked 200 gulden on even, and won. Then I staked the same amount again, and won. And so on some 2 or 3 times. At one moment I must have had in my hands, gathered there within a space of 5 minutes, about 4,000 gulden. That, of course, was the proper moment for me to have departed. But there arose in me a strange sensation as of a challenge to fate, as of a wish to deal her a blow on the cheek, and to put out my tongue at her. Accordingly, I set down the largest stake allowed by the rules, namely 4,000 gulden, and lost. Fired by this mishap, I pulled out all the money left to me, staked it all on the same venture, and again lost. Then I rose from the table, feeling as though I were stupefied. What had happened to me I did not know. But before luncheon I told Polina of my losses, until which time I walked about the park. At luncheon I was as excited as I had been at the meal 3 days ago. Mlle. Blanche and the Frenchman were lunching with us, and it appeared that the former had been to the Casino that morning, and had seen my exploits there. So now she showed me more attention when talking to me, while, for his part, the Frenchman approached me, and asked outright if it had been my own money that I had lost. he appeared to be suspicious as to something being on foot between Polina and myself, but I merely fired up and replied that the money had been all my own. At this the General seemed extremely surprised, and asked me whence I had procured it, whereupon I replied that, though I had begun only with 100 gülden, 6 or 7 rounds had increased my capital to 5,000 or 6,000 gülden, and that subsequently I had lost the whole in 2 rounds. All this, of course, was plausible enough. During my recital I glanced at Polina, but nothing was to be discerned on her face. However, she had allowed me to fire up without correcting me, and from that I concluded that it was my cue to fire up and to conceal the fact that I had been playing on her behalf. At all events, I thought to myself, she in her turn has promised to give me an explanation tonight, and to reveal to me something or another. Although the General appeared to be taking stock of me, he said nothing. Yet I could see uneasiness and annoyance in his face. Perhaps his straitened circumstances made it hard for him to have to hear of piles of gold passing through the hands of an irresponsible fool like myself within the space of a quarter of an hour. Now, I have an idea that last night he and the Frenchman had a sharp encounter with one another. At all events, they closeted themselves together, and then had a long and vehement discussion, after which the Frenchman departed in what appeared to be a passion, but returned early this morning to renew the combat. On hearing of my losses, however, he only remarked with a sharp and even a malicious air that a man ought to go more carefully. Next, for some reason or another, he added that, though a great many Russians go in for gambling, they are no good at the game. "I think that roulette was devised specially for Russians," I retorted. And when the Frenchman smiled contemptuously at my reply, I further remarked that I was sure I was right; also that, speaking of Russians in the capacity of gamblers, I had far more blame for them than praise. Of that he could be quite sure. "Upon what do you base your opinion?" he inquired. "Upon the fact that to the virtues and merits of the civilized Westerner there has become historically added, though this is not his chief point, a capacity for acquiring capital; whereas not only is the Russian incapable of acquiring capital, but also he exhausts it wantonly and of sheer folly. None the less, we Russians often need money; wherefore we are glad of, and greatly devoted to, a method of acquisition like roulette, whereby in a couple of hours one may grow rich without doing any work. This method, I repeat, has a great attraction for us, but since we play in wanton fashion, and without taking any trouble, we almost invariably lose." "To a certain extent that is true," assented the Frenchman with a self-satisfied air. "Oh, no, it is not true," put in the General sternly. "And you," he added to me, "you ought to be ashamed of yourself for traducing your own country." "I beg pardon," I said. "Yet it would be difficult to say which is the worst of the two, Russian ineptitude, or the German method of growing rich through honest toil." "What an extraordinary idea!" cried the General. "And what a Russian idea!" added the Frenchman. I smiled, for I was rather glad to have a quarrel with them. "I would rather live a wandering life in tents," I cried, "than bow the knee to a German idol." "To what idol?" exclaimed the General, now seriously angry. "To the German method of heaping up riches. I have not been here very long, but I can tell you that what I have seen and verified makes my Tartar blood boil. Good Lord! I wish for no virtues of that kind. Yesterday I went for a walk of about 10 versts, and everywhere I found that things were even as we read of them in good German picture books; that every house has its Vater, who is horribly beneficent and extraordinarily honourable. So honourable is he that it is dreadful to have anything to do with him, and I cannot bear people of that sort. Each such Vater has his family, and in the evenings they read improving books aloud. Over their roof-trees there murmur elms and chestnuts. The sun has sunk to his rest, a stork is roosting on the gable, and all is beautifully poetic and touching. Do not be angry, General. Let me tell you something that is even more touching than that. I can remember how, of an evening, my own father, now dead, used to sit under the lime trees in his little garden, and to read books aloud to myself and my mother. Yes, I know how things ought to be done. Yet every German family is bound to slavery and to submission to its Vater. They work like oxen, and amass wealth like Jews. Suppose the Vater has put by a certain number of gulden, which he hands over to his eldest son, in order that the said son may acquire a trade or a small plot of land. Well, one result is to deprive the daughter of a dowry, and so leave her among the unwedded. For the same reason, the parents will have to sell the younger son into bondage or the ranks of the army, in order that he may earn more towards the family capital. Yes, such things are done, for I have been making inquiries on the subject. It is all done out of sheer rectitude, out of a rectitude which is magnified to the point of the younger son believing that he has been rightly sold, and that it is simply idyllic for the victim to rejoice when he is made over into pledge. What more have I to tell? Well, this: that matters bear just as hardly upon the eldest son. Perhaps he has his Gretchen to whom his heart is bound, but he cannot marry her, for the reason that he has not yet amassed sufficient gulden. So the pair wait on in a mood of sincere and virtuous expectation, and smilingly deposit themselves in pawn the while. Gretchen's cheeks grow sunken, and she begins to wither, until at last, after some 20 years, their substance has multiplied, and sufficient gulden have been honorably and virtuously accumulated. Then the Vater blesses his 40-year-old heir and the 35-year-old Gretchen with the sunken bosom and the scarlet nose, after which he bursts into tears, reads the pair a lesson on morality, and dies. In turn, the eldest son becomes a virtuous Vater, and the old story begins again. In 50 or 60 years' time the grandson of the original Vater will have amassed a considerable sum, and that sum he will hand over to his son, and the latter to his son, and so on for several generations, until at length there will issue a Baron Rothschild, or a Hoppe and Company, or the devil knows what. Is it not a beautiful spectacle, the spectacle of a century or two of inherited labor, patience, intellect, rectitude, character, perseverance, and calculation, with a stork sitting on the roof above it all? What is more, they think there can never be anything better than this. Wherefore, from their point of view, they begin to judge the rest of the world, and to censure all who are at fault, that is to say, who are not exactly like themselves. Yes, there you have it in a nutshell. For my own part, I would rather grow fat after the Russian manner, or squander my whole substance at roulette. I have no wish to be Hoppe and Company at the end of 5 generations. I want the money for myself, for in no way do I look upon my personality as necessary to, or meet to be given over to, capital. I may be wrong, but there you have it. Those are my views. How far you may be right in what you have said I do not know, remarked the General moodily, but I do know that you are becoming an insufferable farcer whenever you are given the least chance. As usual, he left his sentence unfinished. Indeed, whenever he embarked upon anything that in the least exceeded the limits of daily small talk, he left unfinished what he was saying. The Frenchman had listened to me contemptuously, with a slight protruding of his eyes, but he could not have understood very much of my harangue. As for Polina, she had looked on with serene indifference. She seemed to have heard neither my voice nor any other during the progress of the meal. Chapter 4. Recording by Bill Borst.